We are back for part 2, thinking more about church and communications in a wider sense, with our wonderful guests giving their different perspectives.
If you've not listened to part 1, then obviously you can go back and listen to that. And why not subscribe at the same time and follow us so that you get a little notification every week when a new episode comes out. And obviously, if you're wanting to link up with any of the guests that we have on, then they're going to tell you how to do that at the end of the episode, but we'll also put their details into the show notes.
So enjoy part 2.
Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Jo.
So jumping back in, and our next question thinks about how we keep close to truth even as culture changes around us. So first, let's hear from Krish Kandaya.
Thinking about Christian leaders, how can leaders ensure they're still speaking the core truths of the Bible, even while our methods of communication are evolving with technology and culture?
Well, that is the perennial opportunity and challenge of living in our world, isn't it? That we help the never-changing gospel to connect with an ever-changing culture. That's been the situation since the beginning of Christianity. Even if you read the book of Acts, the sermons are not all the same because the apostles were trying to find a way to connect with different groups of people, whether that was the day of Pentecost, when you've got a primarily Jewish audience and you're talking about the fulfillment of prophecy, which makes sense to a Jewish crowd, but then suddenly you're talking to farmers who are from a kind of Greek and pagan background, and you're talking about it's God that sends the rain, or Paul in the Areopagus trying to explain the gospel to people that are used to debating philosophy. And guess what? He name drops some philosophers and he name drops some poets. So this challenge of presenting the never-changing gospel in an ever-changing culture is modeled for us in the book of Acts. Or even in the Gospels, you look at Jesus speaking to different groups of people or different individuals, and he is finding a way to build bridges, make connections between the truths that we know and love and the culture and personal circumstances of people. And I think the best way we can develop that is genuinely by having listening conversations with people in our communities. The more time Christian leaders are spending with ordinary people, the more they'll understand what life is like for them, and the more opportunities there will be to connect what we know of the scriptures to that. So John Stott, the brilliant Anglican theologian, used to talk about double listening, that we listen hard to the scriptures, but we listen hard to our culture. That doesn't have to be technical. That doesn't have to be, reading lots of sociology. That can be as simple as spending good time in the Word and then good time in the world, listening to the neighborhood and finding out what's going on. Our politics, I'm speaking from Westminster right now, is known to be disconnected from the lived experience of most people. That there is a Westminster bubble, that people live here and are debating all sorts of things that don't actually impact ordinary people. And my fear is if the church falls into that kind of mindset, that, church leaders have debates about all sorts of things on Twitter with other church leaders, and you think, are you actually listening to what the average person in our community is wrestling with? Or have we somehow become so embroiled in other debates that we're not actually connecting that gospel to where people are at? And I think that's a challenge for all of us, is to stay, as Jesus was, incredibly grounded, talking to ordinary people. He was most known for spending time with all the marginalized people that nobody else wanted to speak to, the poor, the vulnerable, the outcast. That was who Jesus was having daily conversations with. And it'll be a good check, I think, for those of us that are in leadership. How much time are we actually spending with ordinary people, rather than just in our inner circle, in our leadership teams or on our online debates? How can we make sure we're grounding the gospel with the people that we're called to serve in the communities where we live?
Oh, that's so good. I really like how Krish covered sort of a number of really important points. It was effectively kind of like summarizing with, we do need to continue to look at Jesus and how he was present with people. He didn't change the gospel and what he was talking about, but he adapted it to the people that, or he adapted it to the people that were there, but sort of in their context. And so in the language and the sort of examples that they would understand.
And that's something that, as Krish said, we can't do if we're not spending time with people who we should be listening to, the people in our communities,
exactly.
the people that don't know Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like the phrase he used as well, of the never-changing gospel and the ever-changing culture.
That's good.
I think
Yeah.
it's a given that we should be sticking to the gospel and not changing truths
Yeah.
as the culture changes around us. But yeah.
Yeah. And is he said as well, like this sort of spending time with ordinary people and sort of that double listening, but also on that actually like listening to what those people that their context, because as a leader, church leader, you might have one perspective on life and that's totally valid and totally cool. But actually, how are you meant to understand the experiences of young parents or the elderly or working people if you're not in those spaces necessarily? So actually listening, it's not to say that you have to go into that space, but just being willing and able to listen to those people and the things that they face, to how you adapt your not interpretation, but your translation of the gospel to those people.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's listen to the next response now from Glen Scrivener.
It's really important to start there, I think. And my goal is never to figure out what is trending in the world and then to try to work my way backwards to some kind of scriptural relevance. I think that is not the way we do it. And it's not as though we're just bridge builders and we're trying to figure out what a popular topic is and what a popular platform is, and then try and cut our scriptural cloth to that platform. The idea is to go very deeply into the scriptures, to see the glory of Jesus, and then to overflow with him. Our verse at Speak Life is always Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So it's not we're trying to suck people in from the highways and byways. It's that we are to flow from an experience of Jesus and to use every means possible. And so, like, my advice to anyone who wants to have a social media presence is never have a social media presence for its own sake. We talk about these things as platforms. You would never build a platform for its own sake. You only build a platform for an event in which something is going to be proclaimed or shown. And you've just got to keep Jesus front and center. And you've just got to keep your own heart front and center as the thing that needs to overflow. And the phrase that I'm always using is from Wesley and Whitefield back in the 18th century. Here are evangelists that are using the very best of technology, and they're absolutely broadcasting the word far and wide. They're very innovative in how they're trying to proclaim the gospel. But at the end of a hard day's evangelism, Wesley and Whitefield, the number one way they would describe their evangelism is, I offered them Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me about that is they didn't say, I gained converts. And they weren't actually that interested in numbering converts. And they didn't do any of that sort of thing that we tend to do in modern evangelism or in modern social media. They didn't really do those metrics. It was a success if they offered Christ. And so it's very much a supply-oriented thing, not demand-driven. It's very much, I overflow with the Jesus who my heart is filled with, rather than I'm getting pulled. Because if you get pulled, oh my goodness, influencers in social media are not really influencers nowadays, are they? They are, unless they are very careful, they are influenced by their audience, and there's audience capture. And suddenly, through the algorithm, what you do, I just got a spike in my views for that last video, and it wasn't really central to my mission on YouTube. But I'm just gonna shift, and now my next video is gonna be like that, and the audience is gonna lead me further and further away from my core message. And we see that with so many YouTubers, we see that with so many Instagrammers, that there's this audience capture, and that the people we think of as influencers are actually completely influenced by their audience and by the algorithm behind them. There's another reason why you absolutely need to be driven by the Jesus that you're proclaiming, and be so overflowing with him rather than led by the platform or the stats or the audience.
Yeah. So again, that idea of it being a challenge, but we have to know where we're starting, and we're starting with the Bible. We're not looking at what's trending at the moment and thinking, how do we fit that with scripture, or being led by the audience, but starting with the Bible and that truth and going from there. And that's, I think, a really central thing to the way that we shape our message, but also the way that we actually go about it, and our heart, it's to overflow from our own heart, that we need to be wanting to share Christ with people. And that's the reason that we do it, just not for its own sake.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that example that Glenn gave of that, not looking at what's trending and trying to kind of like shoehorn the Bible into it, but rather actually overflowing with the Bible. And, it doesn't matter what else is going around, and not being that kind of like influenced by the world around us, but being sort of grounded in the gospel, and that being the focus rather than being on the platform. And I like that he said that you don't build a platform for platform's sake. It's not about and I think very often about it as like an individual and as a content creator. And I think the same could be kind of for church leaders, but actually also for churches. Don't just be on the platform for platform's sake. Be on it because you have an important message to share. And that's what we should be driven by, not the kind of the stats and the numbers and stuff, but actually it being our worship to Christ, and that, the fruits of it is regardless of the numbers and stuff. It should be that's up to him to decide what it is.
Yeah. That it should be our motivation, but the success of it isn't our motivation, and how people respond to it. We do what we can to offer it in a way that's relevant by using means that are going to reach people, but then it's down to him. Like our metric for success is, are we offering Christ to people? Not, are they responding? Are they being converted? Are they coming to church, or whatever that might be?
Yeah. So let's hear from Carl Knightley and Joe Frost.
Yeah, I think the truth remains the truth. I think what's tricky is that there is more and more, particularly with AI, there's just more and more stuff which isn't true. And it's really hard for people to differentiate, actually, in our post-truth culture and world, particularly online. Is that a quote from somebody they've actually said? Is that something true? So it's easier to get sucked into things. I think where there is an organization leading something, it's easy to coalesce around that. So it's very easy for me to put something supportive that Evangelical Alliance has said, or give Gavin Calver some support when he's saying something. So I think as Christians, the best thing for us to do is to be united in as much as we can be, in sharing truth and where needs to be defending truth.
I think the Bible is genuinely miraculous. It is both timeless and timely. It always manages to speak into a culture, because to be human is both timeless and timely. It's the same. We make the same mistakes. We have the same hang-ups. We operate in the same ways, and yet so culturally specific. So I think for all of us, that duality of listening to God and his word, and really understanding the story that we are a part of, the God story as told across the pages of the Bible, but also listening to the time that we're in, understanding the questions that people are asking, understanding the stories that we are immersed in and how they're shaping people, and bring those two things together. What I find fascinating, we did some Talking Jesus research, which is basically asking questions around how people have come to faith, why people would come to faith, what people think about Jesus and the church and stuff. And one of the questions was, what are the big life questions that you're asking? And what was fascinating about that question, because we offered some answers, like the kind of typical alpha questions. Who is Jesus? What happens when I die? Why is there suffering in the world? Why doesn't God answer prayer? That kind of stuff. The most common answer was none of the above. And what I found fascinating by that is the church is brilliant at teaching us how to answer questions nobody is asking. And actually, the Bible is full of answers for the questions that people are asking. We're just not listening very well to what they are. So I think we have to know our story and trust that it is timeless, it is good, it is life-changing, it is powerful, but also recognize that the power of the stories that we're immersed in and that people we're trying to engage with are immersed in, it's really important to understand the stories that surround us. And that is the gift of communication, to bridge those two and communicate powerfully into that space.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful where Carl started there with it being more difficult these days to tell what is true and what isn't. And we know the Bible is true, but people are generally, they're going to be suspicious of that anyway. But even normal, non-spiritual things, it's getting harder and harder to tell. You know, even as these sources that traditionally we've been able to at least know to use true information, even if they're twisting it, you know, even if it's presented with a bias, we can't necessarily even trust those anymore, because AI is not just something which people are using themselves, but it's something which has now been used to generate content, and it's just getting more and more difficult. And so with that, people are going to be suspicious of everything that claims to be true.
Yeah. Yeah. But I like how he said, like, it's kind of finished with saying, you know, be united in what we create. And I think that kind of goes back to the you know, how much we can argue online and stuff, but actually if we're united in it and support each other, you know, actually that makes for a kind of better place for...
Yeah, we know what's true, so unite around it.
Exactly, rather than arguing and stuff. I really like what Jo said. I just think her sort of exuberance in saying, like, the Bible is this miraculous thing of speaking to people throughout generations. You know, it's not something that is only addressed to and relevant to people at the time it was written. I really like her timeless and timely, and I think that's really that's such a beautiful kind of little phrase, and I just think that was a sort of such a wonderful thing we should be encouraged by, rather than going, ugh, I don't know how we take this going forward. But actually there is so much that is timeless about it, but also that is so relevant to the situations that we go through.
Yeah, and that same theme that that Krish mentioned about that listening in two parts, the duality of listening, as Jo called it, and listening to the Bible, but also listening to the time that we're in, and seeing now through the lens of what the Bible says and the Bible story, but also just actually listening to the questions people are asking, rather than trying to answer things that they're not asking. Yeah
Again, it's that understanding where people's contexts are.
So next we're going to move on to the challenges that Christians face, and particularly when sharing their faith online. So we're going to hear from Jo and Krish first of all.
What are the key challenges that UK Christians face in communicating the gospel in a sort of a public sphere such as online, and how can we get better in equipping them to share their faith?
So I think the key challenge is recognizing just where our stories differ. So as people of the book, as we're sometimes known, our story is the God story. And there are key narrative themes and threads in that story that teach us who we are and how we should live. But they are often jarring with the cultural stories around us. The idea that there is a personal God who cares about what you do and what you think and is intimately involved in your life is just plain weird. Like, sorry, he's listening in. He knows me and has opinions about what I want to. That's just weird. Like, we don't realize that that's kind of strange. The idea that forgiveness isn't just important but essential, that's not just sometimes weird, that's often immoral. Like, actually to ask somebody to forgive somebody that's wronged you isn't actually an ideal anymore. That's the antithesis of that. We have to recognize that sometimes speaking into our public spaces with our story that feels so comfortable and normal and good and right and beautiful can be incredibly jarring. And sometimes we don't even realize where those jarring moments are. And we certainly don't know how to communicate those well so that people can hear the truth and the goodness and the beauty of what we want to share with them, instead of hearing some of those kind of, well, I disagree with that, therefore I disagree with all of this. Actually, where are some of the ways that we can encounter? So bizarrely, I was in Egypt a few years ago, and I was chatting to a missionary organization out there, and they were saying that actually when they're communicating with the Muslim community there, they can't start with John 3:16, because John 3:16 is about God having a son, which in Islam is blasphemy. So they actually need to start in Romans 5. It's still the gospel, but it introduces the gospel before the barriers go up. So they had to recognize the story that they were speaking into in order to find a way to have a say in that conversation. And I think if we can help Christians understand what are the stories that are in the public square, and how can we negotiate the telling of our story in a way that we're heard before the barriers go up. And I think that is really quite a challenging space for us to do. But there's so many people out there asking those sort of questions, engaging, wrestling, that I think God is doing something really interesting in how we're speaking into the public square. And again, it's about innovation and bravery and stepping out and being real, but listening as much as we can before we always speak.
I do think one of the biggest challenges for UK Christians communicating their faith is just understanding where people are coming from. A lot of the time, evangelism is a pre-packaged solution. You know, I was trained in a 4-point gospel message that you would deliver to everybody that you ever met. And part of the problem with that message is it was really a good interpretation of the Christian gospel for a particular time and a particular culture, normally North America in the 1960s. And it didn't necessarily connect with where people were at today. And so we've been kind of trained that evangelism is like, it's basically a one-way bit of communication. It's me telling you the truth. And it's a little bit like in America when they have these adverts for a headache pill. At the end, actually, we do it here as well. At the end of the advert, they'll say, you know, this product has been tried by 1,000 people and 3 people dropped dead, and be careful in case you take it because it might lead to all sorts of horrible symptoms. Or you get it on bank adverts here, don't you? Like, you know, terms and conditions apply, and it's like that is the legal requirement that someone has said that to you as fast as they possibly could. Whether you've understood it and, you know, engaged with it is secondary. They've fulfilled their legal duty of saying these words to you. And I think for some people, that's what evangelism is, you know, this prepackaged gospel that, you know, here the theologically correct. And as long as I've said it to you, then I've done my bit and we're out of here. And again, going back to Jesus, that doesn't seem to be his approach. He's often conversational. He's often asking questions. He doesn't say the same message to 2 people. He seems to adapt it. You know, if you look at John chapter 3, when he's talking to Nicodemus, the dominant metaphor is being born again. And then the next chapter is John chapter 4, and it's the woman at the well, and the dominant metaphor is living water. Jesus, what was the matter with being born again? That's a really great image. You know, why don't you just use that everywhere? And it's because he loves people enough to understand where they're coming from and then connect that never-changing gospel to a never-changing culture in a way that makes sense to people in front of us. So I think the more time we are actually listening, engaging, serving, coming alongside, demonstrating the gospel, the more chance we'll have to actually connect it in a way that makes sense. I think the other big challenge, and this is a little bit philosophical, is that we've divorced the communication of the gospel with the living of the gospel. So, you know, when you look at the word gospel, there are 4 gospels, aren't they, in the New Testament? And the 4 gospels don't just tell you what Jesus said, the read bits. There's lots of bits in the gospels that aren't read, right? And they tell you what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And he fed the hungry, he healed the sick, he came alongside the vulnerable, he spoke up against injustice. And the gospel is all of that. You know, it's what Jesus said and it's what he did. He lived the gospel and he spoke the gospel. And in our culture, I think people are fed up with just people that have an opinion. I mean, there are loads of opinions out there on Twitter, aren't there? And people telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing. But I think there's always openness to people who are genuinely willing to serve. And for me, that's where my world kind of comes in that I love communicating, I love speaking, I love tweeting, but I want to embody the gospel too. That's why I tried to start a movement for people that would foster and adopt vulnerable children. That's why I work with refugees to offer them welcome. It's in the context of practical service that our words make best sense. Jesus said, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." You go, what? You want us to live differently? You want us to walk in the footsteps of you? You want to communicate, not just as a verbal exchange, but an embodied experience? Peter picks it up as well. Live such good lives among the pagans that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. So Peter got it. But sometimes we've disconnected evangelism, apologetics, communication from incarnation and service. Those two things are, as Jesus said, they're together. What God has joined together, let no one separate. God has joined together the preaching and the embodying of the gospel. And when the church divorces itself of that, we lose the ability to actually speak to our culture. The culture is often looking for authenticity. Is this real? Is this true? We've begun to see in our politicians and our leaders a failure for that they say one thing and they do another. And sadly, the church is dealing with the repercussions of so much leadership failure, hasn't it? With all sorts of people coming out with all sorts of abusive behaviors and toxic relationships and, terrible things. And what does that do? That loses credibility for the gospel because we haven't joined these two things together. Again, it's what we love about Jesus, isn't it? He is the Word of God. He lives the gospel. He preaches the gospel, both together.
Oh, so good.
And thankfully, we got the Holy Spirit to help us do it.
Amen.
I mean, both of those were so good, but I just really love
so much there.
Yeah. Again, they've both answered the different question, but Joe's brought up again this sort of listening in order to be able to respond, and actually being able to understand that stories will sort of translate or they need to be done differently in the world. So it's a great example of sort of understanding that actually when they're sharing in different sort of either religious cultures or different countries, where actually there are sort of, again, those differences of having relationships between father and son or women and things like that. And so it's really, again, really important to listen and understand who you're speaking to. But also I love that she said kind of, to recognize the beauty of the story that we have to tell, because actually stories are attractive to people. And, that's what gets people engaged with you, because you're not just listing out some rules or something, but we're having a story that is interesting and hopefully engages people before they kind of like go, oh no, you're talking religious stuff. I don't want to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, and in pointing to Jesus, which is always a pretty good thing to do and good place to start. But, Jesus changes how he speaks depending on who he's speaking to. He uses different illustrations. He has different approaches, and style isn't quite the right word, but, even down to where sometimes he'll be more confrontational with people. Sometimes he'll be more gentle. He might still be firm. Like with the woman at the well, there was a gentleness in approaching her, and yet he was still kind of confrontational to her in pointing out her life. But he can only do that because, and obviously he's going to be the best at doing this, but because he knows her and he knows the approach which is more likely to get through to her. We don't have a crystal ball like that. We don't have a magic thing which is just going to be right. This is going to be the thing which gets to someone's heart. Other than we have the Holy Spirit to do that. That is going to be the thing which unlocks someone's heart. But we are called to still do it well and still try to listen to people and meet them where they're at.
Yeah. But also I think the more we do it, the more you are able to kind of pick up on people's like the nuances or whether they want to be confronted or, I won't say pandered, but sort of, had a bit more of a gentle tone, said to them, if we don't do it, we just won't know.
Yeah. And I think that's also where doing things online can be a lot harder because there isn't going to be as much nuance. You're not going to pick up on all the non-verbal cues when you are let's use the word, arguing with someone on Twitter in a thread, and the chances are that they don't want to be, confronted or spoke to gently. They just want to put their opinion out there, and so it's an additional challenge of thinking, how do we engage with that? But yeah, like we sort of thought about. I know I'm not going to say that. But just thinking, how do we approach things differently there? But also, what does that look like when we are speaking to people in our own communities in person as well?
Yeah. And one of the things I liked what Krish said was the more chance we have to demonstrate the Bible, the more chance we have to talk about it, because the gospel should be lived, not just spoken about. But actually, if we're demonstrating it, we have that opportunity to explain why we're behaving in that way. And again, it's whether that's on site or online, in narrow communications or broad communications, we shouldn't just be spieling it out and that be it, but actually it should be an integral part of how we're living.
Yeah. And again, that's what Jesus did, and it's what culture is looking for at the moment with that authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's take a slightly different approach now as we listen to Glen and Carl's responses.
I think back in the 1990s and the noughties, I think the difference between Christianity and a secular worldview was it was felt, but as we named areas of life in which Christians were thought to be more narrow, the barrier to faith was always considered that, if Christians only believe in, no sex before marriage, then that is a restrictive thing that the non-Christian I'm trying to share my faith with will consider to be too much of a burden, and therefore they will walk away. And whatever moral restrictions people might see in Christianity were thought to be a hurdle for faith on a very individualistic basis. I don't think I could live a chaste life, and therefore I can't be a Christian. And away they'd walk. And that would be the barrier to faith. Whereas far more in the last 20 years, the difference that Christians have morally is repugnant to the world, whether or not that particular non-Christian is affected by the moral view that we take, right? And the difference that Christians stand for in the moral realm is considered to be far more not simply restrictive, but to be wrong and to be repugnant and to be something that is just, what planet are you on? Is what the non-Christian is kind of thinking. But I think there's an opportunity there, because if the non-Christian is saying, "What planet are you on?" they're actually ready, and perhaps more ready, to hear of a different world that we're proclaiming, rather than just a narrow ethic. And I think our difference used to be heard as, Christians just have a narrow ethic that's difficult, and they're foolish and they're naive and they're restrictive. But nowadays, people are like, these Christians, where are they from? Where do they get such different views from? And there's a real gut level accusation of bigotry that can be associated with that. But I think actually also people are much more ready to hear that, no, Christians are really different. And we always have been really different. We were really different back in the 1990s too. It's just that there was a bit more overlap between a secular view and a Christian view. And so what we really have to get good at is navigating how we handle those moral questions, not so that we can be moralists, but so that we can say, we are coming from a totally different standpoint on this. And do you have a moment for me to kind of cast a really different vision for what life is all about and who God might be? So I think Christians need a different kind of help with the moral questions that are often thrown up. And we need to do a better job of, telling a better story, as Glenn Harrison, put it in that great book from a few years ago. So help with navigating the objections that people have, and showing that they come from not just a moral restrictiveness, but from a completely different worldview, a completely different story. And we need help in telling that story.
Yeah, I think that, the Christian truth remains the truth. And I think actually, in a way, it's easier the more society departs from that truth, because it's easy to say this is what we believe in, and offer a better truth. And I think I use the word better because what we say needs to be positive, as opposed to judgmental. It's very easy to say, no, that's wrong, and that's wrong. And actually, that might be wrong. And there will be a place to say that. But I think it's really important for us to be winsome and kind and loving in the way we say things. There are many church leaders who do that really well, but there are others who just end up getting sucked into negativity and judging other people. And we're at a really challenging point, I think, in church in the UK, with big questions being battered around in the Church of England, the Methodist Church, other churches. That's causing a lot of division. And I think it's important that these conversations are had and biblical truth is stood up for. But at the same time, it's whilst we're all arguing with each other, and sometimes that becomes very toxic, that can take away from our wanting to share the love of Jesus with everybody. So we mustn't depart from what we know is true, but we've really got to try to find a way of doing it in as gracious a way as is possible. And also, when we're online, we need to think about that, even just the things that we're liking. There are some, if a church leader is going to be online, or a Christian leader, or anyone who's a Christian is going to be online, they need to understand the technology they're using, because we're all sinful, all fallible. But I've seen some people liking some stuff that perhaps they didn't realize they were liking, or that they didn't realize that people could see they were liking. And sometimes, that's just brutal.
So I think that's really interesting how Glenn and Carl have both sort of pointed out something there that we can often see. It's really depressing that culture is just going so far further and further from the Bible, but actually it's an opportunity because people are seeing this as something different, and how the discussion has moved on from having to wrestle personally with the morality of whether it's right for me to, society is seeing the morality that the Bible presents as offensive and ugly because it jars with what they want to believe. But again, seeing this as a positive thing, it's an opportunity for people to see that Christian worldview is so wildly different, and we just need to help people in navigating that and not talking about moral restrictions as if it were when we were growing up, sort of thing, but just telling this entirely different story.
Yeah, and then as Carl said, it's easy for leaders to get sucked into kind of the negativity, and again, kind of it's very easy to judge others that are, whether it's online or again sort of on site. But at the same time, we need to be standing up for biblical truth. That's the first thing, but that's super important. And actually, because the toxicness that can often happen actually really detracts. It's just negative anyway, but actually it detracts people from wanting to engage with us, and actually probably then detracts people from wanting to share, full stop, because there is this kind of bickeringness between each other and stuff.
But then going back to that idea of being united, because this happens inside the church as well. And I think that's sort of what Carl was getting at, of saying there are these fights going on in the church at the moment. And, sometimes when there's stuff going on which is wrong, we do need to fight for it. But still being able to do that in a gracious way and still being able to unite around the gospel, that united theme just keeps coming up again and again because it is so public.
Yeah. And I think it's, again, sometimes it can be too easy to get into a habit or a nature of arguing and stuff, or not quite using online in the best productive way. And I think sometimes people forget how public a sphere it is, and that it doesn't matter even if you've deleted it, it can still be found. And
that goes not just for the stuff that you're saying and posting as well, but also how you're using it and the things that you're liking or engaging with.
Exactly.
People can see that.
Yeah. And it's very easy to, I don't know, offline give this impression of, oh, I'm a perfect Christian or whatever, and then online being really different. But actually people, again, it goes back to that, we're looking for authenticity, that people, it's so easy for us to put two and two together, or, you know, put you, the person, with who your online persona might be, and go, actually, these aren't really aligning. And actually we need to remember that online is actually an incredibly public space. Probably you have a greater reach, which is a positive thing. We have a greater reach than we do probably day to day on site. But actually we need to bear that in mind with our responsibility and how we behave online. Yeah.
Yeah. And like we thought about in the last episode, not separating out the spiritual from the kind of non-spiritual, not separating out the online from the offline, that this is all part of living life and discipleship. And it will all be found out. You know, I think of, I really enjoyed basketball, and so follow the NBA. And there have been instances of referees with these like burner accounts that they think they're completely anonymous, and they're posting all of this like hate against certain players or teams. And then they get found out, and probably should have lost their jobs, and whether they did or not, I don't know. Let's not get into that. But even when people think things are secret, even when it doesn't come out into the public, it's going to come out one day. And it's that importance of, you know, whether people see it or not, whether it's just that our Heavenly Father sees it and no one else on earth sees it, we are still called to live godly lives. We're still called to live above reproach. And so just being even more careful with these online platforms and how we use them, because people will see it and will judge us for it.
Absolutely.
And so our last question, on a bit of a lighter note, is asking our guests any particular campaigns or anything that has stuck out to them as being a really good example to follow. So let's see what Jo has to say.
Are you able to think of an example of a particular campaign or ideas within communications that have really got people engaged, or that you found particularly inspiring?
So I was really thinking about this question, and I even surveyed around the desks at work, going, what have people seen? And there was a worrying silence. And I was like, oh, that's a bit depressing. But then actually, I thought, I don't see a load of campaigns, but what I do see is individuals picking up their phone and telling their story, offering their perspective, narrating their prayer life, asking questions out into their spaces, the nano influencers, the micro influencers, the this is my story into their networks. Actually, it's much less campaigny, come and share a hashtag or be part of this prayer for a month. Actually, it's really organic. It's really natural. It's really ordinary people sharing ordinary stories out online and into virtual spaces, and engaging with people all over the world with the power of their testimony and with the work of the Spirit. And I think actually for me, that isn't depressing. That's really exciting. Yeah. That we don't have to wait until the next campaign and the next hashtag turns up, but we can just pick up our phones and tell people what Jesus is doing in our lives, and that people are really hungry to hear those kind of stories.
It's funny that we asked Jo about sort of any particular campaigns, and she said that actually it's less about the campaigns, but I think her point is really, really good, because actually it's about that connecting with people. It's not about trying to have some big campaign, you know, big sort of strategized thing that will obviously go viral, but actually about, you know, that narrow casting, that sort of intimate micro influencing, talking directly to people and say, you know, connecting with them, allowing things to resonate with them. And I think that's a really powerful way of looking at it, and actually quite an encouraging way that we don't all have to be, whether you're a small church, an individual, a church leader, working for an organization or something, you don't have to have this big thing to be able to reach and connect with people.
Yeah. Yeah. And the power of stories in when you're connecting with people as well, that even if that story is as small as, hey, I just saw this, you might like it. Like that's something that clearly it's affected me enough for me to share it with you.
Yeah.
And I think, hopefully that's something that people can connect with. But ultimately, again, just going back to, it's the work of the Spirit. Like it's God that wakes people up. It's God that breaks the chains. So just relying on him as we do go about this.
Yeah.
So taking a little bit of a different route then, in our chats with Carl and Glenn, they both talked a little bit more about the campaigns and what they've seen working there.
It's really good if we use social media and online communications really well. And I think that can be really powerful. I think, the warm welcome campaign has just been so wonderful. And online has been a big part of that, and churches then suddenly think, oh, I can open up my doors when it's really cold. And the way that has just gone viral has just demonstrated the power of technology and online technology. And so that's kind of one main Christian one that jumps out to mind. And years ago, 2015, this is not a Christian one, but I'm just excited about it, so I've got to say it. You can cut it if you need to. I've got two kids, 10 and 7, and I had one at the time. And he was 18 months old or whatever. And the BBC were threatening to get rid of CBeebies and put it onto an online-only platform. And I was very upset about that. And I must have had too much time on my hands, so I started a petition on change.org or whatever it's called. And I didn't put any money into it. I just used Twitter and Facebook, and it went viral. Because I had a good hashtag. And that's why I'm mentioning the power of social media. So hashtag save CBeebies. You can type it in now and you'll still see it there. My petition was signed by 132,000 people in about 2 weeks, because it plugged into Mum's Net and these sorts of people, the mummy blogs, and then the BBC backed down and kept it. And I've got cutouts of being in national press and so on. I'm not just saying it was just down to me, but when they backed down, I was upset because I felt like I was 5 minutes away from being on Loose Women. But the reason I mention this is, if you find something that people really tap into, and bringing us back into the Christian sphere, if you know your why are you doing it, and it is encouraging, then boy, can you really make a difference.
So we are trying this thing with 321course.com, which is trying to be a Christianity 101 for a digital age. And we're just trying to leverage the ways in which people search for anything. The way you search for a plumber will be that first you Google, and then you go on YouTube, and then you go to check a trade. And it's an entirely online experience. In the same way, when people say, can I find Jesus? First they go on Google, then they go on YouTube, then they might find their way to a social media channel or whatever it is. And then they might binge some Netflix documentaries, and then they might subscribe to a podcast, and then they might fall down a YouTube hole. And what we really want to do is not adapt, but to be in those places where people are actually seeking, and to have our content there in a way that makes sense for a digital age. And so just over Christmas, we did these Christmas campaigns, where we did some great animation, beautiful 3D animation of a kind of a cathedral, and I did sort of Christianity in 321. Here's Christmas in 321, and it was this spoken word poem and beautiful music accompanying it. And it didn't do that well on YouTube, but it did really well on Twitter, and it did phenomenally well on Facebook. And it just drove well over 10,000 people to 321course.com. And that's the nature of broadcast, isn't it? Broadcast means you cast the seed broadly onto different soil types. And YouTube was like, yeah. Twitter was like, yeah. And Facebook was like, come on. And we've had 1,400 people now go through the course, because it's a Amazing. Funnel, and the people who end up at the end of the system aren't the people that are less than the people that go into the top of the funnel. But that's one example of us just trying to cast a seed broadly. And once they get to 321course.com, there is hours worth of Christian content there that they can kind of explore in their own way. And what's good about it is, having done episode 1, the next thing that's going to be fed to them is not another cat video or, some dance from TikTok. The next video that's going to be fed to them is episode 2 and then episode 3. And so we are still trying to solve all sorts of problems with the bounce rate. We're still trying to solve all sorts of problems. We can drive all sorts of traffic, but as soon as we ask for people to start up an account, of course, there's going to be a bounce from that, and we want to reduce that as much as we possibly can. But I think we're hitting upon something that is working, and I think we're trying to go with the grain of the way in which people are processing things these days. And yeah, and if others have wisdom on this, I'd love to hear it. But I think it's early days for us actually tailoring our message to an online generation that explores everything online, and does it with the long form podcasts and listens to hour-long YouTube videos and like how do we tailor a message? We're really trying, but I think we are right at the beginning. We are absolute noobs at this, but we look around us and we're like, well, who else is trying stuff? We need collaboration on this because this is where people are.
I think it's really funny because, certainly to me, it feels like we've been doing digital comms forever, and even thinking about it as a church for quite a while. And yeah, I think there is something in what Glenn said there about it. Actually, we're really right at the beginning of doing this because it's not just about the tech and whatever social media platform happens to be trending right now or taking off, but it's about figuring out the heart and the psychology of how people are using online. And yeah, I think, as much as we've said about narrowcasting and sharing with people one-to-one and all of that, it's not wrong to think tactically about it either. And so I think that's obviously what sorry, hang on, I lost it's formatted differently. It's not wrong to think tactically about it either. And so that's obviously what Glenn and Speak Life have been trying to do, and to sort of tap into just seeing how people are looking for information online and what that journey looks like. Because if we understand that, we can then actually, seek to meet people on it. And at the same time, remembering that different campaigns will work well across different platforms, whether or not we can always predict that.
And it's funny how he's sort of saying, and can anyone shed light on this? Because, even though they are thought leaders and they are, fairly advanced in using social and stuff, yet, they can't answer it. And I don't think that probably anyone really can say why the same video isn't that responded on one platform yet is absolutely devoured on something else. And I think that's a little bit of encouragement for anyone creating something that actually it's okay if it doesn't work, but it's also a reason to put it out in as many places as you can, because you never know where it might hit.
Yeah. Yeah, and thinking with what Carl was saying as well, with the hashtag save CBDs and all with the warm welcome as well. To be honest, that remembering that there is power with social media, that it can actually bring change in the, I don't want to say the real world. Social media is the real world, but in the offline world, we can connect with different people there, and especially if we're finding things that are resonating with people. We need to be looking for those things, looking for the things that people care about, because it can take off. Again, it won't always be predictable, but when it takes off, it really takes off.
Yeah. And I like how he finished with sort of knowing your why. And I think that is really important for anyone. But as Christians, we need to know why we are doing these things, because then it goes back to what's your motivation of is the reason we're doing these and we are posting these videos, this graphic, this sermon, this invite, because we want the likes and the accolades and the success that comes with that? Or is it because we're actually trying to reach people for the kingdom? By knowing your why, it keeps you focused on actually what matters.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's see what comes to mind for Krish.
Well, where to start? I'm hoping you're hearing. I think Jesus is the master communicator. So anything we ever do should be footnotes on what he did. And I think for me, the power of storytelling is probably the most impressive thing about Jesus's communication. Apart from he lived it and he spoke it, the way he told stories was so powerful. Interestingly, the four Gospels are stories, aren't they? They are they're the story of the life of Jesus. But within the story of the life of Jesus, he tells parables, because parables cut through in a way that just straight truth proclamation doesn't. The guy standing there with Jesus Christ is Lord on the end of a soapbox, or with a sign above his head, is proclaiming truth, but he's not necessarily engaging an audience. And storytelling is so powerful because it abducts you. It steals your imagination. It borrows your time. And while you're doing that, someone said a parable is something that keeps you talking on the front doorstep while truth creeps in the back window. I think that's just such a really wonderful way of seeing it. And I think we have so many stories to tell. Firstly, of course, we need to tell the story of Jesus in its fullness. Secondly, we need to tell the stories that Jesus told because they are timeless and powerful. And thirdly, I think we can tell our own stories of what God has done in our lives. I think it's rare. I think even in the Gospels it says, he never taught without telling a parable. And you go, wow, is that true for most of our communication? Is it story-based, or is it all very factual and all very bullet pointy and PowerPointy? Or is it captivating like a story could be? So I think whenever we've managed to tell stories, we've cut through. That's been true in the media. I had the opportunity to help with a Radio 4 Lent series. And we found a story of a young woman who was on a train to work, and she noticed the person sitting opposite her was a young girl with a very old man, and she sensed something was wrong. And she was quite nervous because, she thought this was a trafficking situation. And so in the story she told, she said, I prayed, Jesus, help me to do the right thing here. And she, gifted by the Holy Spirit, some courage. And so she managed to communicate with the girl and separate the guy, and the girl got to safety. Wow. And we told that story on Radio 4, and Radio 4 loved it. And they put it on the BBC website as as not a kind of religious story, but as a lifestyle story. It ended up being the most clicked on story on the whole BBC website for that year.
Wow.
And it was because it was a compelling story. So a girl talking about standing up for justice, calling on the grace of God and asking Jesus for help. That was incredible. And all we were doing was following in the footsteps of Jesus and utilizing the power of story.
Yeah. So, it's an obvious answer, isn't it? But Jesus, he is the master communicator. And with all of this, we're not seeking to make a name for ourselves, but we're seeking to point to him.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good thing to repeat to ourselves. And I'm thinking of myself in this, but for us to all do that, it's very easy if this has got loads of likes. But yeah, it shouldn't be about that. And I suppose that because that doesn't just need to be for online and social media, but for, how big our church is, or, how big our business is. But what I really do, they've all said such sort of wonderful, insightful, helpful things. But it's really nice to kind of finish on the fact of the power of storytelling. And, that is something that we're quite excited to be talking about in a future episode. So do stick around. But I was really moved when Krish was sharing that story, because it's probably all something that we could either see ourselves in viewing, or as, being there and seeing something happen when you feel, well, should I intervene? Should I say something? And the fact that actually when they have told that story, it was the most was it what he said? The most popular one for the year.
Yeah.
And you just think that's a religious story. It's talking about someone praying and the Holy Spirit. Actually, are people going to be really off it? But actually, no, that has power. And actually the having someone own that story and sort of be willing to share it is incredibly powerful. And it's just really, really inspiring, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that was really good of Krish to end us in such a profound way. Except that's not quite where we end, because my heart sank slightly as I realised we had one more question.
We did have one more. It's the most important question of all the questions we could ever ask anyone, isn't it?
Let's play the clip. We have to ask you, if you could choose one, would it be a gourd or a pomegranate?
Well, I am somebody who loves Scrabble. I love English. I spend lots of time with important, intellectual, fancy people, and yet I don't know what a gourd is. So there we go. On that basis, I'm going to go for pomegranate because they look wonderful. I mean, pomegranate is an example of God's creation, just showing like how can creation be an accident when you look at pomegranate?
Yeah.
And my kids love pomegranate, so for me, it's pomegranate.
Well, it probably isn't that unusual. I've never had a gourd. And I actually only know what a gourd is because of The Lion King.
Okay,
Sorry.
That's fine. My first thought is Life of Brian. So
there you go. so we're there. But I do have a really to die for pomegranate salad. Oh. So I have to go for the pomegranate because it is really good.
Well, I was recently in Bethlehem just before Christmas, and I got to eat a lot of pomegranate, and it was wonderful. So Bethlehem and the Middle East are obviously going through a lot of trauma right now, and so eating pomegranates will remind me to pray for that situation, pray for peace in that region of the world.
That's brilliant. And lovely. A much more profound answer to a very silly question than I was expecting.
In the immortal words of Monty Python, follow the gourd!
Yay! We finally got a gourd. That's so funny hearing them all.
I can't tell you how ridiculous it felt asking that question. Like after such intense chats that we'd had with people, and not only like having to do it on 4 separate occasions as well. But anyway, I guess it's great to get their input on that too. And I think we definitely need to get some data going on that ongoing gourd or pomegranate debate.
Yeah, you should have a sort of just continual social media one of what people favourite, which is pretty much it is everything. It's everyone except for Glen has said pomegranate, so
pretty much
the pomegranates are winning. But we'd like to say a very, 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 very big thank you to all of our guests for coming on and chatting to us. We had an amazing time, and I think you can agree that they provided some really fantastic insights and perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. So our next episode, we're going to go straight back to the practical, actionable comms tips. So come back to hear about content repurposing in the next episode. But in the meantime, we'll leave you with the details of how you connect with our brilliant guests. If people want to find you online, where would they do that?
So they can go to @CarlKnightly and they'll find me on Twitter/X, as well as LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook.
Sanctuaryfoundation.org.uk is our website, and very happy to take wise advice from communication experts around the country. So if you've got some advice for us, that would be great. I tweet a lot at Krish K, and Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram are probably our most useful channels at the moment.
Well, there are so many platforms out there, aren't there? Probably Twitter, refuse to call it X, stuck in my ways. So Twitter, I'm at Jo Frosty. Instagram, I'm at Jo Frosty, but with an IE, just to confuse things. Or Being Human Lens or EA UK. So any of those platforms and you'll probably find me.
You can find us at speaklife.org.uk, but if you want a real experience of the sort of thing that we produce, then you can follow our YouTube channel. Just search for Speak Life Media on YouTube, or you can go and do our new interactive course, 321course.com. I think that'll be a lot of fun for you.